When Kelly, Cristina, and her husband, Juvenal, stopped appearing outside their small home in Camaçari, neighbors assumed it was nothing serious, but by the fourth day, their disappearance became suspicious. And when officers finally stepped inside their home, they expected to find a medical emergency or a family problem. Instead, behind the home, in a patch of soil, they found the first sign that this case would not follow any pattern they knew. It carried details involving missing organs that were never recovered and many more atrocities that the lead detective struggled to say out loud. The evidence surrounding the death of the couple raised the possibility of something far worse than. The details of this case would make you cringe, but stick around because it's worth hearing, and you'll decide if justice was served or not. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Kelly Cristina Amaral was in her early 40s. She lived a quiet and predictable life in the neighborhood of Santo Antonio in Camaçari, Bahia. People who knew her often described her as modest, warm, and steady in her daily routines. She carried herself with the kind of gentleness that made neighbors feel comfortable stopping to say hello, even if the conversations were brief. And her husband, 57-year-old Juvenal Amaral Neto, carried the same calm energy, and the two of them had built a simple, middle-class life in a home that reflected their personalities. Nothing extravagant, but well-kept, peaceful, and always open to those they trusted. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable enough to manage their needs and still hire a cleaner who had a grandson to help around the house. When Kelly received a compensation payout of about 70,000 reais, which is about $13,000 toward the end of 2017, she didn't treat it like a sudden transformation of her life. She treated it as a blessing that would help with bills, home repairs, and small comforts. And because Kelly wasn't someone who flaunted anything, she saw no need to speak loudly about it. However, one afternoon, the cleaner mentioned the payout to her grandson, but the grandson repeated it later to a group of friends, and what started as a harmless remark inside a home became a story that drifted through a social circle that included people who didn't know Kelly personally, but knew enough about money and opportunity to pay attention. Kelly and Juvenal had no way of knowing that a single sentence spoken in passing had already set their fate in motion. That was how the information reached people like Neves Santos Filho, who was 29 and already familiar with shortcuts that crossed legal boundaries. And once Daniel heard the amount, he didn't dismiss it. He asked questions, pressed for the source. He brought the rumor to Carlos Alberto Neres Jr., a man in his mid-20s who operated with the same mindset, and the two of them decided they needed to verify the story before taking any step forward. And the moment the adults understood the couple's routine, the plan stopped being a rumor and became a structure. Then came the decision that sealed the plan completely, the choice to take weapons. Daniel insisted they needed them to keep control, and Carlos agreed because he knew the presence of guns would force the couple to obey quickly. By the evening of Friday, January 5th, the plan the group had talked about quietly for days finally solidified into action. Kelly and Juvenal had settled into their routine that night, and nothing about the hours leading up to the invasion suggested that danger was approaching. When they forced their way inside, the shock to Kelly and Juvenal was immediate. Kelly and Juvenal were overpowered almost as soon as the group entered, and they were restrained before they could say more than a few confused words, because Daniel wanted control from the beginning, and he believed that immobilizing them quickly would eliminate any complications. So Kelly's hands were tied, and Juvenal was forced to the ground, and the couple found themselves trapped in their own home with no clear idea of who these people were or what they wanted. The group searched the house, opening drawers and cabinets. Daniel demanded information while the others scattered through the space. Where is the money? Because he believed the compensation payout was hidden somewhere inside. But Kelly and Juvenal kept insisting that there was no money in the house. But their answers didn't satisfy the group, and the adults interpreted the fear in their voices as resistance rather than honesty. Kelly and Juvenal were completely restrained and unable to move while the group continued tearing through the home. And when the questions about the money continued and the couple still insisted they didn't have anything hidden, the intruders escalated in the only direction they understood: violence. began with the group forcing themselves on her, one after another, and the brutality of it was made even worse by the fact that Juvenal was held in place and made to watch, because the intruders believed that witnessing her suffering would break whatever resolve he supposedly had. Later, when Delegata Maria Teresa Santos spoke about this stage of the crime, she didn't soften what had happened or try to explain it with complicated language. They wanted the money, they wanted to and they wanted to. Kelly had already endured humiliation and knife wounds, and Juvenal had already watched helplessly while trying to protect her with words that the attackers refused to believe. But once every denial fell flat and every repeated plea failed to produce the payday the intruders expected, the violence shifted into something far more extreme, and the line between robbery and pure brutality disappeared completely. Kelly was the first to face this escalation. A fire was brought into the attack, and parts of her body were burned while she was still alive, because the group believed that the fear and pain would finally break whatever resistance they imagined she had. Her arm was amputated while she was conscious. But the attackers didn't stop there, and as they continued their they cut through soft tissue in multiple areas of her body, removing organs that only trained professionals should ever handle. Her ovaries and fallopian tubes were taken out completely, and the fact that these organs were missing later became one of the key moments in understanding the level of violence she endured. At this point, I strongly believe that the money is not inside that house, because no one would want to keep such money when it's obvious that these armed robbers are clearly ready to take your life in the most unhuman way possible. But Juvenal wasn't spared from this stage of the attack, and the knife wounds along his back were described in detail by investigators afterward. His flesh was repeatedly while he was alive, and the cuts weren't the kind used to end a life quickly. They were the kind meant to inflict pain slowly. It was during this phase that detectives began considering a possibility that shocked even the investigators, because while the forensic team did not issue a conclusive report confirming cannibalism, the evidence they found forced them to acknowledge the suspicion. The viscera, ovaries, fallopian tubes, and other organs removed from Kelly's body were never recovered, and the nature of the cuts suggested deliberate separation of tissue from bone. Delegata Maria Teresa Santos, who led the investigation, stated openly, "Everything leads us to believe they practiced cannibalism. The viscera and organs were not found." What happened next would only confirm that the attackers never intended to let either Kelly or Juvenal survive. And the final acts they carried out inside that small home in Camaçari would leave a permanent mark on everyone who later read the case file. After the prolonged period of captivity and torture, Carlos Alberto Neres Jr. hanged both victims. Then the killers buried the couple in a shallow grave behind their own home, and they set the remains on fire before covering them, as if the combination of burning and burial would erase every trace of what happened. By January 9th, something in the neighborhood felt wrong. Kelly and Juvenal weren't the type of people who vanished without mentioning it to someone, so the concern grew gradually. Someone decided to call the police. As officers moved into the backyard, the ground caught their attention almost immediately. There was a patch of earth that looked recently disturbed, and although it wasn't an obvious burial site at first glance, when they took a closer look, the soil appeared looser than the rest of the yard. So the officers began probing gently at first, then digging with more certainty once the first layers of earth revealed inconsistencies. Then, within the first few minutes of digging, the unmistakable sight of human remains emerged, and everything that had been speculation moments earlier became a confirmed tragedy. The officers uncovered the shallow graves where Kelly and Juvenal had been placed, and the recovery team was called immediately because the scene was not only a burial site, it was the endpoint of a crime that investigators would later describe as one of the most brutal they had ever seen. However, the discovery ended the period of uncertainty for the community, but it also opened the door to an investigation that would soon reveal the full scale of the violence inflicted on Kelly and Juvenal. And as officers secured the scene and began their documentation, it became clear that the backyard held answers the suspects never expected anyone to find so quickly. Once the bodies were recovered from the shallow graves behind the Amaral home, the investigation moved quickly, and the focus shifted from uncovering what happened to identifying who was responsible. But the case had already drawn the attention of Saipi Polo Industrial, a specialized policing unit in Bahia trained to deal with high-risk operations, and their officers began combing through the neighborhood for any sign of unusual activity or individuals connected to the victims. And because the crime involved multiple people, it didn't take long before the wrong details slipped into the wrong ears. setting off a chain reaction that led officers directly to the suspects. On January 9th, PSYP teams located the teenagers first, and the shift in their expression was immediate the moment officers approached. They tried to maintain composure, but the pressure of what they had witnessed and participated in was too heavy to conceal, so when the officers asked direct questions, the facade cracked almost instantly. The adults, Daniel Neves, Santos Filho, and Carlos Alberto Neres Jr., were found shortly after, and officers immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation because both men were already known locally for smaller offenses. Through hours of questioning, the investigators pieced together the sequence that had begun with a rumor and ended with 2 lives destroyed. The motive, as the adults explained, revolved entirely around the $70,000 real compensation payout they believed Kelly had stored inside the home. The teenagers confirmed that the cleaner's grandson had provided the initial information, and this detail aligned directly with the detective's earlier statement that the crime was premeditated specifically because someone inside the victim's circle had passed along the information. By the time the interrogations ended, detectives understood not only what happened, but also how each participant fit into the plan. And the calmness of the suspects, their lack of emotion, their insistence on partial truths, left investigators with a chilling sense that the brutality of the crime wasn't driven by panic or loss of control, but by deliberate choices made long before the first blow was struck. The psychological weight of these interrogations stayed with the team, and as the details were compiled into the final investigative report, the case became one that even seasoned officers struggled to set aside. When the forensic team finally began examining the remains of Kelly Cristina Amaral and her husband, Juvenal Amaral Neto, the scale of the violence became clearer than anything the suspects had admitted. The investigators who processed the scene had already warned that the bodies showed signs of extreme, but it wasn't until the final report was compiled that the full picture of what happened in those final hours could be understood. Cristina's body showed burn marks across several areas, and the pattern of these injuries confirmed that she had been burned while still alive, because the tissue response indicated active blood circulation at the time the injuries were inflicted. Her right arm had been amputated, and the forensic specialist made clear in the report that the amputation occurred while she was alive, because the edges of the wound showed vital reaction. But the cut wasn't clean, so the bone showed signs of forceful removal. And this was only the beginning, because once the examination moved further into the torso injuries, the findings became even more disturbing. While the legal process moved forward and the case gained national attention, another chapter unfolded far from the courtroom, inside the cells where 2 of the adult suspects, Daniel Neves, Santos Filho, and Carlos Alberto Neres Jr., were held. Their crimes had circulated quickly through the detention facility, and news of the and murder of a middle-aged couple spread among inmates who had their own unspoken rules about what crossed the line, even in prison. And once the details reached the other men in the cell block, the atmosphere around Daniel and Carlos shifted sharply. They weren't treated like typical detainees, and the hostility they faced built quietly until the night a group of inmates cornered them in a shared cell, forcing them into acts meant to humiliate and punish rather than injure. The video recorded inside the facility, later leaked online, showed the 2 men being beaten, ordered to strip, and forced to perform sex acts on each other as other inmates watched and recorded. The attackers made them repeat degrading phrases, including explicit admissions of what they had done, and the tone of the video made it clear that the punishment was meant to reflect the brutality of their crime. Once the forensic reports were finalized and the interrogations had exposed the full extent of the suspects' involvement, the legal process moved forward, and the charges brought against the group reflected both the brutality of the crime and the specific roles each participant played. The 2 adults, Daniel Neves Santos Filho and Carlos Alberto Neres Jr., were formally indicted for latrocinio, which in Brazil refers to robbery followed by death, and this single charge alone carried extremely high penalties. But because the investigation had uncovered prolonged and the deliberate concealment of the bodies, prosecutors added additional charges for concealment of a corpse, illegal possession of firearms, and corruption of minors, since all 3 teenagers had been recruited into the crime under their influence. The teenagers, on the other hand, faced a narrower but still severe set of charges. However, because Brazil's juvenile justice system operates under strict legal constraints designed to prioritize rehabilitation over long-term punishment, The teens were processed through the socio-educational system, where the maximum period of confinement for minors, regardless of crime, is 3 years. The adults' sentences, however, were never fully documented in public records. The indictments were confirmed, and the charges were severe enough to carry decades of imprisonment. But the official outcome, whether Daniel and Carlos received long-term sentences, life-equivalent terms, or plea arrangements, was not released through the major news sources that covered the case. This lack of transparency became one of the most frustrating points for those who followed the investigation closely, because the severity of the crime created an expectation that the final penalties should match the brutality revealed by the forensic evidence. So the case left the community with a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that the suspects had been identified and charged, but frustration that the legal system, especially for the minors, did not allow harsher sentencing. And because the adult outcomes were not made public, the full legal conclusion remained partly unsatisfying, adding another layer of complexity to a case that had already shaken the region with its brutality. And long after the police files were closed, their names continued to echo as a reminder of how easily a quiet life can be shattered by the choices of those who never understood the weight of what they were doing, or they were simply just heartless. Now, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have been done to prevent something like this? And was justice served in this case? Do you think the cleaner ought to face justice too? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. We read every single one of them. And if this story moved you, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories just like this one. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself and stay safe. Cheers.